Hi everyone, my name is Erik Adler and today I want to talk to you about Sven Delblanc, who was a Canadian-Swedish writer. He wrote novels and plays and he also worked for Swedish television. And Sven Delblanc was born in 1931 in Manitoba in Canada. His family came from Sweden but originally from France, and one of the grandfathers of Sven Delblanc served in Napoleon's army, but he deserted and came to Saxony in Germany, and later they wandered off to Sweden. And Sven Delblanc was born in Canada, but they moved early to Uppsala, where he lived most of his life. His father wanted to be a farmer in Canada. That's why they went there. And Sven Delblanc has had a very difficult relationship to his father. His father was very hard on him, he was very abusive physically, and this strongly colored Sven Delblanc's worldview. His view of life was very pessimistic and very dark, and he had a kind of religious craving, which you can find again and again in the books. He was never able to really believe in God, at least not as understood by a certain religion like Protestantism, for example. But there is a religious craving and need in his books, and together with this dark view of life, it forms a very existential setting for his stories. Sven Delblanc was 61 years old when he died in 1992 of cancer. He was a professor of Swedish literature at Uppsala University, where he worked for many years. For a few years in the 70s, he was also a guest professor at Berkeley. And what I'm going to discuss here is his debut novel from 1962, which is called Hermit Crab, the Hermit Crab, which is something like a mix of fantasy and science fiction, you can say. It's a dystopic novel with certain similarities to George Orwell's 1984, but I think this book actually is a better novel than 1984. I recently saw the movie 1984 again. From the year 1984, it was shot in April and May 1984 when the book takes place, and it's a good movie. Of course, I also read the book, but I think Sven Delblanc's book is better, according to my opinion. It's more exciting, and there's more variety, and he delves deeper into philosophical topics. And it's also a very beautiful book, a very beautiful text. He uses a lot of metaphors. And now we will delve into this book, and this time I'm going to talk about the contents of the book somewhat more, because as far as I know, this book does not exist in English yet. It was published in 1962, but I researched the internet, but I was not able to find an English translation, unfortunately. A few other of Sven Delblanc's works have been translated into English, but as far as I know, not this one. I really hope it will be translated, and it should be translated, because it's a very exciting book, very interesting, very deep, and I think also important, because it's about basic human questions like freedom. That's a big topic of the book. It's about dictatorship, it's about religion, and very existential themes. And as I said, personally I think it's better than 1984, which is still very widely read today. 1984, I mean. I heard it last year, I believe it was again on top of the bestseller lists here in Germany. And The Hermit Crab by Sven Delblanc, I think has been somewhat forgotten even in Sweden. And it's a pity, because, as I said, it's very, very interesting, and now we will delve into these topics, and I really look forward to discussing this book with you because I read it first time in 1997 as a student, and I've never been able to forget it actually. I read it again now, actually because of my teaching, and I am very happy that I had the opportunity to take the time to read it again, because it's a book that really makes you think about society today, what it's like, what it could be like, and we'll have a look at topics also that were of interest to Thomas Mann, for example, about bourgeois life, about the artist's life. You can interpret this book in many different ways. You can discuss the topic of tourism, first world, third world problems, and many other things. So I hope this will be interesting to you, and I look forward to discussing this also with you. You're welcome to leave your comments in the comment section, say what you thought of this presentation, and I see you in my next video.
Axel is a young man serving as an officer in a military camp called the prison, located in a forest. The lives of the inmates consists of hard work and military exercise. But Axel longs for another life, for the freedom to self-discovery and to personal development in shaping his own destiny. One day he finds an old watchtower in the woods, from which he can see the borders of the prison, and he starts planning his escape. This makes him neglect his duties, and he is called to his commanding officer, who warns him of the consequences. Degradation to the lowest rank in the camp hierarchy, that of the fools. The fools are people who believe in God and in paradise. They are forced to do the worst kind of work, which consists of building new defenses and taking care of the latrines. Axel's superior accuses him of nurturing a sick dream of freedom. Alex is not walking the roads of freedom, he says. During a second conversation, Alex's superior tells him that what is freedom is decided by the command, and that there are no absolute and independent values. For Alex, freedom means the right to decide oneself how to act. To the commanding officer, this kind of freedom is superficial, and thus worthless, since it is external. Your freedom is a freedom to choose the evil that you cannot avoid, he says. According to him, Axel refuses to fulfill his role out of pride and arrogance. He doesn't want to be of use to others. Although not a religious person like the fools, Alex has a strange vision when watching the sun setting over the camp buildings. Some gulls land on the yard and then take flight again, glittering in the sunlight. In this moment, Alex experiences a higher state of mind. Time stops, he feels reborn, and he knows that nothing can hurt him. Before his degradation, after which escape will be virtually impossible, Alex gathers some food he has stolen from the kitchen and runs off. When climbing the fence surrounding the prison, he thinks he sees his superior standing among the trees, watching. In the camp, there are rumors of a white city in the south. After having walked for days, Alex finally arrives at the city, which is completely built of white stone. Near the city, he comes upon some farmers. Although their eyes are empty, and they all seem strangely absent-minded, they are very friendly, and they invite him to eat with them. They tell him they work when they want to, and they take a break whenever they feel to. During the meal, the youngest daughter, Katja, tries to undress and to seduce Axel in front of her family. Deeply embarrassed, Axel rejects her. The farmers just laugh at this, telling him that he needs to get used to the freedom outside the walls of the prison. Katja then has sex with 2 boys instead. To save Axel the embarrassment, the 3 hide behind a bush, but they are still visible to everyone. Axel is shocked and decides to continue to the city. In the city, which is simply called the White City, people dress in bright colors and they all seem calm and happy. The farmers have given him a letter of recommendation to Lilith, a student at the local university, and told him to seek out the boulevard where people meet at nights. Axel gets into a conversation with 2 young men, Simon and Daniel, who are acquainted with Lilith. Axel is still wearing his army uniform, and everyone present congratulate him on his escape and treat him with the utmost friendliness. Axel is happy. It feels like coming home at last. Lilith shows up. She's beautiful and charming and invites him to her home. There are no criminals in the city, Lilith tells him during the walk. Ascetics, self-mutilators and idealists are sent to an institution for re-education. This worries Axel, but he tries not to think about it. Lilith starts making sexual advances. Axel is attracted to her, but is shocked to hear that she is married. When they enter her home, her husband is just preparing dinner and he gives Axel a very hearty welcome. Lilith continues her sexual advances right in front of her husband. Axel, extremely embarrassed, asks her to stop. She then strips naked. Her husband politely asks if she wants to be alone with her guest for a longer period of time, and when she affirms this, he just leaves, without showing any trace of disappointment or jealousy or sadness. Axel stays with Lilith, and they spend some happy days together, although Alex is surprised by the fact that Lilith is unable to remember her husband's name. The summer is at its zenith, and it gets unbearably hot in the city. Lilith becomes more and more frustrated. She tells him she wants to go alone to hear a lecture about mythology at the Cultural and Wellness Center called The Bath. In The Bath, there are concert halls, a theater and a cinema, lecture rooms, a library, and a spa with a sauna. The Bath is located in the center of the city, and it was built to commemorate the union of body and of soul. Reluctantly, Axel agrees to this. When Lilith is at the bath, he goes to see Simon and Daniel at the cafe where he first met them. But Lilith's husband is also there. He greets Axel very friendly, and when Axel refuses to join them, he just laughs and leaves. Simon now accuses Axel for being rude to Lilith's husband, and when Axel answers by insulting him, he explodes with anger. Axel expects a fight, but Simon immediately calms down and seems to have forgotten about the whole thing. They drink for a while, after which Simon gets up and leaves without a word. Daniel tells Axel that that's normal in the city and that they have found a way to rid themselves of their aggression. Axel thinks they live capriciously, always following their temporary instincts, and he doesn't like the thought of not being able to feel any sexual jealousy whatsoever. Daniel responds that Axel is still unconsciously following the patterns he was trained to follow in the prison. In the city there are no patterns, he says. Alex wanted to escape the drill in his camp, and now he complains about the lack of drill in the city. Lilith returns home from the bath. She is tired but calm, and Axel notices there are bruises all over her body. The next day she takes him to see the singing statues, giant stone statues of gods at the shores of the sea, formerly worshipped by the people of the city. At sunrise, the wind blowing through the stone produces something like music. To keep the statues from withering away for reasons of tourism, they have been partly restored, but in the process the oldest of the statues lost its voice. But it's no loss, she says, since the statues had withered so much that its song had been transformed into a terrible scream, which robbed the listeners of their sanity. Lilith wants to take a bath, but Axel is ashamed of stripping naked in front of the statues, since they portray the former gods of this people. To Lilith, however, they are just sightseeing objects. The religious traditions have long been forgotten, she tells him. They make camp in a cave at the foot of the statues, and the next morning Lilith wakes Axel in time to hear the song of the two younger statues. But as the sun rises, the older statue starts screaming. The withering process has opened the stone again for the wind. Some gulls circle around the stone giant's head as it's glowing in the red light of the rising sun. On hearing the scream, Axel again has his vision, like once back in the prison. Time stands still, his sight narrows to a point of whirling fire, and he feels reborn. However, Lilith cannot stand the screaming, since she has been purged of her emotions by the city's training program, and so she is unable to open herself up to a religious experience. In agony, she throws a rock at the statue's bird nose, destroying part of the beak, thus silencing it for good. Metaphorically speaking, she kills the god, destroying the possibility of mystical unity, not just for herself, but for others as well. She now claims that she threw the stone to protect Alex from going insane. If this is true, there is still a spark of humanity in her. When they leave the place, Alex has a feeling that there is something that he has to remember, since his whole life depends upon it, but still he fails to do so. In the evening, Lilith takes Axel to the bath for the first time. Earlier, Simon and Daniel mentioned some courses that people new to the city have to take before being allowed to enter the bath, but Lilith has persuaded the administration to grant Axel access to the facilities. However, he is not allowed to enter the basement. After having promised to join Axel later, Lilith disappears into the basement. Axel strolls through the upper floors and finds a hall where a man is giving a lecture. It's the next part in the lecture series about mythology that Lilith said she went to. The lecturer presents a new version of Hercules' cleaning of the stables of Augeas from Greek mythology. According to legend, Hercules led 2 rivers through the stables, but the lecturer presents another interpretation of the myth. Hercules did not use the rivers to clean the stables. Instead, he forced the animals out and then he sets the stables on fire. However, the animals went insane. They ran back into the burning stables and died, he says. The lecturer's story infuriates the audience. To Alex's horror, they grab the man, strip him, and eat him alive. Then they attack Alex, who manages to escape. In the corridor, Alex meets Daniel and asks him to help him leave the bath. But Daniel, who has the same dead gaze as everyone else in the city, suddenly changes before his eyes. His jaw turns into that of a wild animal, his fingers to claws, and he tries to attack Axel, who flees down into the basement. There he finds a huge arena with people seated like in a Greek theatre, looking down into a big pit, built as a funnel and consisting of levels with ledges. The stench is almost unbearable. On the ledges, groups of men and women are engaged in sexual activities. On the bottom of the pit, he sees Lilith like a big white snake, covered in filth and in blood, and with men sucking her body. In disgust, Axel covers one eye, but eventually he forces himself to watch with both eyes open. Somehow he manages to escape from the bath and the White City. He is saved by Tobias, an old fisher who lives alone with his daughter Judith in a farm on the coast. During a fishing trip, they catch a small dolphin and a crab. Tobias explains to Axel that the dolphin is worthless because its skin is full of worms. The dolphins are able to shake off the worms by tumbling at the surface of the water, but often they choose not to, because the worms transfer a poison to them, which makes their blood flow lighter, which is pleasant to them. Eventually, they are so full of poison that they die. Then Tobias tells Alex about the hermit crab, which has no natural protection for its lower body, which leads it to seek shelter in an abandoned shell. It then drags the shell with it everywhere, and if it outgrows its shell, it has to find another one before being eaten by other animals of the sea. If it cannot find a new empty shell, it must return to its former one, and if it cannot find it, or if the shell has been occupied by another animal, it will die. Alex is deeply troubled by the story. To him, it's like living in a house which doesn't belong to you. He throws the crab back into the water. Tobias and Judith are both deeply religious people. Judith always wears the same black dress. Her skin is never tanned by the sun. She wears her hair in a traditional style. She is constantly working, and she never smiles. In his conversations with her, Alex compares the people of the White City to a jellyfish. It has no consciousness and no feelings. It remembers nothing, and it dies without leaving a trace, he says. He also tells her about the prison. But Judith is unable to understand the reasons for his leaving. Neither she nor Tobias would have left, she says, because the outside world is not important. What counts is just our inner life, and thus it doesn't matter where you live. To Judith and to Tobias, there is no real freedom in this world, just in the next, the world of God. Axel tells her that he knows there is something spiritual, because he has sensed it a few times, but he doubts it's what she is talking about. The Hermit Crab is a dystopian novel which shows certain similarities to George Orwell's 1984. In both books, letters arrive through physical tubes, and Axel's visit to his commanding officer resembles that of Smith to O'Brien. However, I think that The Hermit Crab is a better novel, and it is also far more philosophical. Dystopian novels are normally classified as science fiction, since they are thought to take place in the future, even if there is no explicit futuristic technology. In The Hermit Crab, the technology is that of the time in which it was written, i.e. around 1960, except for the letter transporting tubes. There are vacuum jugs made out of glass and telephone booths. The weapons consist of rifles and machine guns, and the prison is protected by barbed wire only. Men wear corduroy trousers and women wear skirts, and everyone is smoking all the time. There are no computers, just typewriters. This gives a 60s feel to the story and makes one think of alternative history novels rather than of science fiction. In addition, there are some fantasy elements to the story, primarily of course the giant statues of gods, but also the setting. A forest colony and a white city, both without real names, and Tobias and Judith's simple farmhouse, which has a slightly medieval, or at least ancient, feel to it. The book is full of metaphors. Almost all of them are beautiful, like the days passed softly and gently, like fingertips caressing the face of someone sleeping. Today, however, this style of writing feels somewhat outdated, and the overabundance of metaphors slows the pacing of the story. But there are also very beautiful descriptions, like a few plummets made of glass were hanging from the roof, throwing sea-green reflexes on the wall. When he raised his arm, it looked as if he were dipping it in shimmering green seawater. A few passages were written in the present tense, whereas the rest of the book was written in the past tense, which is slightly confusing, although the author's intention is clear. The use of the present tense creates an impression of urgency. The text is somewhat repetitive. Certain words and descriptions are repeated several times. Once, the same sentence occurs twice in the same paragraph, part 2, chapter 4. Delblanc also makes use of a few archaic words, like older words for backpack, favor, and perhaps, which are no longer in use. The perspective in the story is mainly personal, namely that of Axel, but sometimes the narrator turns into an authoritarian storyteller, informing us, for example, what Axel as well as Lilith experience in a certain situation, and commenting on what happens. For example, she was like a newborn child, smiling without knowing what her smile meant. And occasionally Delblanc tells the reader things that he ought to show us, like in "The intellect began to calm down due to the anesthetic of love." The theme of the book is human freedom. Alex's philosophical journey goes from seeking external freedom to seeking internal freedom. Finally, he realizes that inner freedom, which is the only true freedom, presupposes obedience and submission, which is what his commanding officer in the prison had told him. He knew it all along, and he brought the prison with him on his journey. His first thought on the morning after his escape was that he wanted to return to the prison and accept any punishment just to get away from this indifferent, cold freedom, as he called it. The prison may be interpreted as a satire of a country in our industrialized Western world, or of a traditional bourgeois lifestyle. The White City, with its happy inhabitants and its unlimited sexual freedom, as a picture of a third world country open to tourism, at least as people in the industrialized part of the world wish to imagine them, or possibly as a metaphor for an artist's existence. On this interpretation, Alex is either a tourist from the north who longs for the outgoing joyfulness he hopes to find in a southern culture, or he is a man living an ordered and sheltered but fairly boring middle-class life, dreaming of a life of adventure and of sexual fulfillment outside the boundaries of his social class. Of course, these interpretations are not mutually exclusive. Although initially enchanted by what he experiences, eventually his fascination turns into fear and disgust when the traditions he comes upon deviate too much from the moral standards to which he was raised. The sauna in the bath in the White City resembles a swinger club, and the city dwellers turn out to be monsters in disguise who threaten to eat him alive, which metaphorically means destroying his fragile self, which is held together by his bourgeois morality. His uniform highlights his stiffness and his inability to let go of his self-control. Axel both wants and does not want to look into the pit. Fascinated as well as disgusted and horrified by the forbidden sexuality practiced below. The pit, filthy, bloody and stinking, resembles a vagina as well as Dante's Inferno, and symbolizes the fear of the animalistic part of human nature. His fear and his unwillingness to give up the values of the prison turn Axel into a lonely voyeur, unable to take part in the pleasures he witnesses. All life came together in his lonely, searching eye, the narrator tells us. It's an exaggerated version of the typical experience of someone away from home. Initial fascination, turning into estrangement and fear and the wish to return home to the safety of one's own culture, however oppressive. But there is evidence too for the interpretation of Axel's inner struggle as that between a bourgeois and an artist's experience. Great men, it says, are set free from the prison by way of public sanction. This can be seen as a metaphor for very successful artists whose eccentricity is tolerated by society because of their fame and wealth. When Axel comes to the house of Tobias and Judith, autumn has set in, symbolizing a new stage in Axel's journey towards self-insight. Tobias's story about the dolphins and the worms sounds like a picture of human corruption, by alcohol and other drugs, as well as of power. It is pleasant at first, but you get used to it without realizing it, and you become more and more dependent on it, being unable to turn back, and eventually it destroys you. During his stay in the White City, Axel starts adjusting to the capricious life among the inhabitants. He no longer judges everything from a moral standpoint, instead acting more on instinct. He realizes it only when he has left the city and found the way to the farm. The hermit crab, of course, is a metaphor for Axel himself, who is constantly looking for external salvation instead of turning his gaze inwards and finding strength within himself. But Tobias's explanations made him start thinking. Faith offers him no solution. For Axel, there is no world beyond this one. The spiritual force he experienced is not located outside this world, but within it. It's the center of life, a wallowing fire of creative change.